Now, you may have a full-blown battle. There are Christian schools that need to be battled because maybe they're not doing things in a distinctively Christian way. And we as parents need to ask those questions. But generally, I think you can believe the best. If someone's working in a Christian school, it's likely they're doing it for baseline pretty good reasons. They've got the best intentions for your kids.
Hey, welcome into this latest edition of Making the Leap. Great to have you along. Chris solo again today. Christine is still on the road traveling with our daughter, but that means more time for me. I don't have to share the show, and I'm glad because this one is a deep dive and one that I think for people that are concerned about a true biblically based Christian education for your kids. You know, we talk about Christian education, but the one thing we consistently say on this show, there's a school with a cross on the door and calls themselves a Christian school. Biblical integration, biblical immersion is quite another thing, and that should matter to most of us when you're seeking it out. And there's a gentleman, our guest today, who has literally written the book on this. What does it mean to integrate your child fully immerse them in a biblically based education? Beyond Biblical Integration, Roger Erdvig is the author, and he joins us today. Roger, I'm so glad to have you on the show. Welcome aboard.
Yeah, Chris, great to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
I value your input because when I say you wrote the book on it, you also travel and you talk about this a lot and you lecture on this. That's my kind of 30,000-foot takeaway is a lot of parents in particular think, I'm sending my kid to a Christian school, good enough. I think you'd probably argue that point.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, I'm a strong proponent for Christian schooling. But with a qualifier, I want to make sure that those schools are truly doing what their websites and their mission statements state that they're doing. So that's where our work primarily lies.
And let's start with, there are a number of educators in this audience, as well as parents who either have their children in Christian school or are thinking about it. Are there kind of best practices, bullet points, jumping off points to test yourself? To test yourself as an educator, a school, or a parent sending your kids to school? What are the, if you want, kind of telltale signs I'm doing it well?
Yeah, probably the biggest telltale sign, whether it's in a school or in our homes, and I'm a dad of 5 kids, grandfather of 5, so I think a lot about homes too, is whether we're seeing all of life as one unified whole, or whether we're seeing and treating life, as Francis Schaeffer wrote about, kind of in bits and pieces. By that I mean we have our Sunday or maybe Wednesday small group life, our youth group life, and then we have the rest of our life, which isn't necessarily pagan, but it maybe is not fully saturated with the kingdom of God in our thinking and the way we desire. And so to me, one of the biggest bullet point things that you'd want to check off for ourselves or for a school that we're considering investing in for the sake of our children is everything this unified whole saturated with a biblical worldview, or is it kind of in bits and pieces where we have different areas of life or different areas of school life that are kind of cordoned off from one another?
I know that this is a bone of contention with a lot of parents. To me, it's pretty clear. If your school doesn't have a statement of faith, if they don't lay this out pretty clearly from the jump, Roger, we are a biblically based school. We believe in biblical integration. If those things aren't set up front, and by the way, they don't ask you to pledge the same thing, that's probably a warning sign, isn't it?
Yeah, and I do find that probably the majority of Christian schools are going to have some kind of a statement of faith. And then a smaller subset is going to have a statement of how that faith immerses the academic learning. And that's really what I'm passionate about, because I don't think we really need to be raising our kids with the idea that there's this separate statement of faith, and then there's geometry, and then there's AP chemistry, but actually having them all together. And those are the kind of questions I think parents need to be asking the Christian schools where they're considering investing.
I love this conversation because I think for a lot of people that are newer to it, my daughter, we put her in a private Christian school 3 years ago, so we're really learning. Our boys did not attend a Christian school. Were we to do it all over again, we would do it differently today, but that's the whole point of making the leap. And so one of the things I love to ask, we've discussed this before, but from smart people like you, how do you make geometry biblically based? If a parent were to ask you that, I don't get it. I want to send my son or daughter to a Christian school, but what's math have to do with the Bible? How do you answer that?
Yeah, Chris, and I'm glad you brought up math, because that typically is the first ones in the first subject area in people's minds where they say, yeah, How do you do that? Does that mean your story problems have biblical principles in it? Like the ark was X number of cubits long and X number of cubits wide, X number of cubits high. So what's the area or the volume of the ark? Now that would be the lowest level. I mean, that's really, really low hanging fruit to handle education that way. And I think our kids can see through that, and it feels kind of contrived. So when we talk about biblical worldview immersion, what we're envisioning and what we help teachers to do is look at everything in their classroom as an opportunity to focus on biblical worldview formation of our students. Now, of course, that means we look to find what God has to say about our subject area and what our subject area has to say about God. But that's really only the starting point. The bigger picture perspective is saying, okay, I'm a classroom teacher. God has gifted me with these 20 students in this class, or maybe 100 students throughout the day. How can I harness everything I do in the classroom, which means how I relate with my students, how I assess their mastery of academic content, how I facilitate discussion in the classroom, everything that I do as a classroom. How can I, as a classroom teacher, how can I harness that to train my students in the dynamics of biblical worldview formation? So it doesn't always have to mean I'm looking for a Bible content principle that applies to my class, although that's super important. But rather, I'm engineering the very environment to be fertile ground for worldview formation. It's almost like we as individual classroom teachers look at each of our classrooms as a greenhouse for a biblical worldview. And there's so many elements that go into that. And it goes far beyond, thus the name of my book, just bringing biblical content to bear on the subject area. It's actually how we teach.
That's big, and it's also difficult. I would imagine the bigger a Christian school gets and the bigger a staff gets, how would you recommend a school, because we do have a lot of educators that listen, Christian educators that listen to this show. How do you recommend Christian schools, if you want, I don't like to say policing, audit themselves, audit their teachers to keep with what you just said? That's tough on an individual basis. I mean, I imagine, I remember when I was growing up in public school, Roger, that the principal would come and sit in the back of the class once a semester and watch the teacher teach, right?
Sure.
Is that where we want to go with Christian schools, that the administrator would sit in the back and make sure the teacher is teaching through that biblical integration prism you were talking about?
Well, certainly frontline academic leaders or instructional leaders, which could be the principal, which could be department chair, could be academic dean, curriculum and instruction director. Absolutely, they need to be in their classrooms an awful lot of time. In fact, I like to say that our classrooms should have permeable walls and doors. Sometimes teachers are like, hey, this is my classroom, give me the curriculum and leave me alone. Well, I don't think that's really a good model for doing biblical worldview immersion in a school system, the entire school. So yes, absolutely, instructional leaders need to be in the classroom a lot. But it is more about an overall mindset and philosophy of education that the leadership of the school really needs to understand. And then they need to be able to pass that on through not just inspection, but modeling, through discussion, through reflection, means like that, to have their teachers really understand this concept. So visiting the classroom is important, but that's only one part of the equation. And it really has to be kind of a Deuteronomy chapter 6 approach to even school life, where everything is immersed with the kingdom of God. Now, academic leaders are famous for saying, hey, we got to do this in the classroom, and they forget the ball field or the basketball court or homecoming or the prom or clubs after school. So really, for academic leaders and leaders of educational institutions to do biblical worldview immersion well, it really has to immerse like everything, even the hallways.
It's a culture, is what you're describing.
That's exactly what I'm saying, Chris.
And schools can quickly get away from that. I mean, I don't mean to sound negative about it, but I think we've heard stories in the past of Christian schools that have gotten quite big, because there is a great interest right now in Christian schools, and they are blowing up in size.
Absolutely.
And they're building as fast as they can in many cases. Our daughter's school is expanding rapidly.
Yep.
Hard to quality control when you're growing at a rapid clip, isn't it?
It is, and there's several key reasons for that. One is the distraction factor. We're putting up a new fine arts building. We're putting in a new turf field. We're adding academic classroom space. So, man, we get focused on the brick and mortar, all of which is super important. Number two, like you mentioned, Chris, there's been a mass exodus from public schools. And so families are coming into the school who may or may not be fully mission aligned. And honestly, as a school head myself for over 14 years, I know that it's very difficult to make sure people are mission aligned, but that is an issue today more than it's been in the past 10 years or so, where people are flocking to us, but they're not so much flocking to us as much as they are from where they are. So you've got that dynamic. Third dynamic.
If I may, sorry to interrupt, but that's a key distinction. Coming to something versus fleeing something is a big deal.
And honestly, as a school head, I loved when people came to my school.
Yeah.
But it was a little bit harder to ask the question, why? Are you coming to or are you coming from? So that is a key distinctive. I'm glad you picked that up. The third would be this growth has caused school after school after school. And I work with some of the best named Christian schools around the country, some of the biggest ones. They are all struggling. I want to say that again, Chris. Every large Christian school that I work with, prominent Christian schools, names everyone would recognize, are struggling to staff their growth. Why are they struggling? Well, because there's not a whole lot of veteran Christian school teachers just waiting to pick up a call saying, hey, would you like to come work at our school? So who do we go to? We go to the delightful Christians that are sitting in the church pews that are teachers in public schools. And they're coming into the Christian school world. God bless them for coming. But we have to be really, really careful that we do a much better job of orienting these delightful Christian people who may or may not really understand the depth of a biblical worldview and how it should apply in the classroom. We've got to orient them well to the unique environment of doing biblical worldview immersion in the Christian schools. So those are the three things I think are really making it tough right now.
You know, Roger, I don't know how much you know about the Herzog Foundation, but I've been privileged over the years to sit in and watch a lot of trainings that we do with Christian educators, administrators, and teachers. They come through here. We do different trainings on various factors that go into running a Christian school well.
Yeah.
And one of the testimonies I heard was from a former public school teacher, very emotional, when she said she was almost overwhelmed with her freedom to live out her Christian faith in class. And that hit me, that she was so accustomed to keeping that hidden. She had been so trained up in public school to hide it under a bushel basket, so to speak, that I do kind of wonder what you're saying. You've almost been trained to purposely ignore biblical integration. So you really have to be educated to warm to it again.
Exactly. And you think about it, I find the majority of teachers coming into Christian schools from public school have not been trained one day in a Christian environment for education. So they've gone to secular undergraduate, they've gone to secular university, and they've taught in secular schools their entire careers. Now, what does that mean? Secular does not always mean it's antagonistic against faith, although it's becoming more and more like that. But basically, by the very definition of what secular is, it's education minus God. And you've learned to teach without God. You've learned to assess student performance without God. You've learned to relate with students without an overt reliance or exposure to God. You've learned how to coach basketball without God. You've learned all these things over patterns, over habitual patterns of how you operate, so you can essentially keep your job and function in that environment. And then all of a sudden you're put into a radically new environment, and we give you a week of orientation before the school year. We give you your curriculum and say, go to it, deliver our distinctively Christian mission. Yeah, that does not work. We need lots more patience and lots more time to prepare and mentor and train new teachers. And it doesn't stop with going away to a great event like the Herzog Foundation. It is mentorship in the school, in the classroom, in their daily lives.
Yeah, that's big. Do you find a lot of people we deal with here too are starting their own Christian school? Is it easier to launch and start a Christian school, as maybe many members of this audience have done in the last year, and establish a culture rather than try to reintroduce it once your school's well established and on its way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I often use the analogy from the construction trades. Back in my teens and 20s, I worked in my dad's construction company, and we would have customers that want us to redo the entire house, but they want to live in it while we're there. It's much easier to say, you know what, how about you guys go live at the mainstay for a while we rehab the whole thing. So yeah, there's something really attractive to starting from the ground up with a board that's fully aligned, with no stale tradition to work against, with brand new curriculum, and being able to set the stage clean right from the beginning. I think there's a lot of pros to going that way. Now, that's not to say you can't still renovate the house while everybody's living in it, but I can see why that's a very attractive concept for people today.
So people listening in who are parents and may hear, well, that's fine for administrators of a school and teachers, but here I am a parent, my child is already in a Christian school. How do I audit them? Or if I see something that I don't feel is fully biblically integrated, what's my responsibility to that school? Do I raise my hand? Do I object? Do I go to a meeting? Do I go to the board? What do we do there?
Yeah, well, the short answer to that question is yes. You have a responsibility, and I would say a moral obligation to ask good questions and to make suggestions when it's appropriate. What'll be different from school to school is how that kind of input is received. For instance, in one school I was leading actually through COVID, I had a parent that wanted to know the date and time of the board meeting so she could come and address the board. Well, in our school, that wasn't an appropriate way to bring input to the table. She was thinking from a public school mindset, okay, the boards must be public meetings. I can go, I can get my name on a list, I can have my 2 minutes to share, and then I'll hear the response. So she was approaching it without asking the question first, and this is what I would recommend for parents. And she's a delightful lady, by the way, a friend to this day. But you call your head of school or your principal, whoever you have connection with, and say, hey, I've got some questions and I've got some feedback. How would you best receive that? In other words, what's the best forum for me to share those things? If it's in writing, I'm happy to do it. If it's to come in for a meeting, I'm happy to do it. But the first step would be for you to just knock on the door and find out from a decision maker what the best way to bring input is. But absolutely. Now, the challenge, too, is that, like we talked about, you have all different teachers in all different classrooms who have all different levels of understanding of biblical worldview and how to create environments that are conducive to biblical worldview formation. So, for instance, you're going to get maybe an upper school English teacher that's going to show a clip from a movie that you feel is really inappropriate, and your first response is like, whoa, why was that shown? Why was that movie even recommended to my students? Well, it's easy to make some assumptions about why that was happening, but it's a little bit harder to actually write an email to that teacher and say, hey, I have some questions about something my daughter came home with. Might we be able to chat about it? So I always recommend people to go, if they're big picture considerations and questions, go to the top. If they are micro considerations about maybe something that happened in the classroom or the band room or on the baseball team, well, obviously go to the leader first and ask how to best have that conversation.
That's helpful because it is, through all the years that I remember the kids in public school, it was so often suiting up in armor and getting ready to charge into battle. You'd like to believe that in most scenarios, parents, students, teachers are all relatively close to the same page, and that it's just maybe a clarifier that's necessary. It's not a full-blown battle you're about to have.
Right. Now, you may have a full-blown battle. There are Christian schools that need to be battled because maybe they're not doing things in a distinctively Christian way. And we as parents need to ask those questions. But generally, I think you can believe the best. If someone's working in a Christian school, it's likely they're doing it for baseline, pretty good reasons. They've got the best intentions for your kids.
Do you hear stories of parents that have gotten involved, called up a teacher, or sent an email and said, hey, I'd like to talk, I'd like to ask questions, and a teacher, in fact, reflects on the objection or the concern and says, I hadn't thought of it that way, and course corrects?
Absolutely. I've seen many in my tenure as a head of school. I'd be privy to some of those things that were going on, and I would hear about teachers that would even come to me and say, hey, parent asked me about this material we use. What do you think about it? How can we process it through? I'll give you a good example. I have an AP literature teacher that was working on selecting the books that would be summer reading for the AP class before they came in the fall. And not only did he take and listen to what parents said, he brought that into me as the head of school and said, hey, how can we best reflect a biblical worldview? And what he wasn't asking is, should I use all Christian books? Because I would have said, no, please don't do that. But he was concerned enough to make sure that the way he was representing our school by even the materials and the way he handled the materials. So there's a great example of someone who would listen to parents. And I find most teachers want to hear from parents, but just like anyone, like if I was to call you up, Chris, and give you some constructive criticism about how this podcast ran, your first response may be, okay, I think I want to hear that. So by human nature, we all, we get our dander up first or we get our defenses up first. But if we can look past that, I think most parents will find that most Christian school teachers are delightful people that really want the best for your kids.
Roger, you said something interesting there about, teaching books or literature that aren't biblical. And you'd say, yes, that's important. I think that's an interesting point. A lot of people that are considering Christian school or don't know Christian school well, maybe incorrectly think that if my kids are reading, they're reading a chapter of the Bible and that's it. You're saying no, that's not. There's no reason that you couldn't teach the kids Huckleberry Finn or what have you and still do it in a biblical way. Yeah,
and there's so many reasons for that. And I could probably bullet point too many to have time for, but I'll give you a couple reasons. Number one is there is a lot that is right, good, beautiful, and true that doesn't have a Christian signature on it. And the reason is because authors all throughout the time, try as they might, cannot escape the image of God. And so as they are sub-creators of the great creator, much of what even pagans produce has an element of beauty to it. It has an element of truth to it that we want to be able to help our kids to see and to understand. So just because a painting was painted by a pagan painter does not mean that I, as a human being, cannot relish the beauty and the craftsmanship of that painting or that house or that book. My disclaimer to that is sometimes, and I've seen this in Christian schools, a Christian school teacher can think they're on a one-man or one-woman mission to make sure these kids are not sheltered, by golly, and so they give them everything that they don't need. So I'm not saying that. But the other piece, and this circles back to this concept of biblical worldview immersion and biblical worldview formation. One of the research-based ways we know that an individual's desires or their core being can be drawn towards that which is right and good and true is to be carefully and methodically exposed to that which is not right, good, and true. Now, I'm not, again, saying throw them in the deep end with all the pagan influences, but I'm saying a caring, loving, shepherding teacher that can, in an age-appropriate way, begin to expose students to that which is not true. God actually uses that to draw our hearts even more towards what is true. So as we experience the poverty of the truth claims that are coming from our culture and really experiencing them, like looking at them, dissecting them, understanding them, God takes that and draws our hearts to his kingdom, as long as it's done carefully with a shepherding teacher. So I think it's very important to expose our kids to that which is coming from people other than people within the fold.
And that is a key component to a Christian education, is it not? To learn what outside influences are coming at you and challenging you. You have
Absolutely.
to learn. And my daughter often says that one of the things she loves so much about her immersion in Christian school is her ability to really articulate and defend her point of view, something that she really, and sadly I wasn't able to help her with that, but her school has helped her be able to articulate her faith. Yeah.
And that requires the kind of exposure you're talking about. There's this really fascinating research study that shows the power of ideas and how we catch them almost like viruses. And it had 4 separate groups and 1 control group, and they went through this whole thing. And the bottom line, they found that the young people that were able to most stick with a true idea were the ones who were carefully exposed to false ideas. And so it's this idea of inoculation, that we have to look at our Christian schooling, part inoculation against the world's idea viruses. But just like with a real virus, without getting some of that virus into our system, we don't build up the resistance to it. And it was fascinating because we as Christians often think we just got to tell the kids the truth. We just got to have the truth. They just got to memorize the truth. And I agree with all that. But in this study, those that just heard the true ideas and were not, quote, inoculated against the wrong ideas, actually had a lower resistance to those wrong ideas later. So it's just really, really fascinating. And that's really what we're talking about.
If you teach, said another way, I'll dumb it down for myself. If you teach kids the falsehood, the mistruth, the lie,
yes,
in the counter to what they're learning, if they understand that early, then when they encounter it in real life, they they reject it because they've already learned why it's false.
Exactly. They've examined it. They've lived in it. They've processed it, always up against the truth. I'm not saying to do that devoid of that. But yes, absolutely. From the youngest, we need to begin those skills. And how much more so? I mean, when you and I were kids, I'm assuming we're somewhere around the same age. Boy, there were some idea viruses out there. But in general, a lot in the North American Western culture was promoting biblical worldview ideals. You can even look at it at television or popular media, things like that. We were not immersed in an environment that was completely anti-God. The kids growing up today are the first generation to really be immersed in a completely anti-God society. So we need to really prepare them in a different way than you and I were prepared.
Not to make this too, I guess, dark or newsy, but that is one of the stories I've read about this 26-year-old man who just assassinated that CEO in cold blood. A private school, educated. I think he was valedictorian. He went to an Ivy League school, but he was deeply into computers. And what struck me, Roger, was that this is a brilliant kid of privilege, but had totally devalued human life. It just had no concept of humanity. And it's like you can have the best, most quality education and still just be a stone cold, soulless human being.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating. If you were to go to UPenn, where he went to school, and found the Marxist ideas and the philosophies that drive neo-Marxism, unfortunately, what he did would not be a surprise. And I don't believe I'm overstating that.
Yeah, and you just wonder how many kids are like that in an era. And I think about COVID too. We have encouraged isolation in our children as well. That kind of cold, humanless environment. I guess we can raise a whole generation of people that really have no understanding of humanity.
And the incredible power of the neo-Marxist narrative that we're all either oppressors or oppressed. And I know you know about that. I've seen you talk about that before, but that has been drilled down from kindergarten in this guy's life. This has been drilled down at UPenn, at Harvard, at Yale. These things have been drilled down. So what is the natural consequence of those ideas? We've got to overthrow the oppressors. And no matter what it takes in a classic Marxist perspective, is he was doing what was right because he was overthrowing the oppressor.
And you can safely assume that most kids, I guess I won't say all because you never like to paint with a broad brush, but you can assume that a great deal of our kids across the country in public school are getting some dose of that at either an aggressive level or a modest level. Do you feel that way?
Chris, the most popularly cited academic work in all of academia, so we're talking about all of the education dissertations over the last 30 to 40 years, the most popular book was a little-known book at the time from the 1970s, late 60s, 1970s, Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. It was a Marxist view of education. The entire generation of secular educators, unless they were really perceptive and had good parents that were helping them steer clear of it, were born and raised steeped in Marxist philosophy. And now that is what they're teaching, and that's what we're seeing. Absolutely.
And again, it's why we get back to this show, why Making the Leap became a thing to begin with, is to encourage parents to start thinking about this. And even if you don't know, is your book, Roger, Beyond Biblical Integration, is it a read you'd recommend for parents who are considering Christian education, or is it a little too heavy a lift?
No, actually, I wrote it to not be a heavy lift, either for teachers or parents. It's directly to teachers in schools, but I can't tell you how many parents read it and say, oh, that's what I want for my kid at school. And then secondly, they say, you know what? I can do this at home. So yes, absolutely, I recommend it to parents.
What can people find at summit.org?
Yeah, so Summit, where I serve as the director of the Center for Biblical Worldview Formation, what Summit has done for well over 60 years is 2-week worldview intensive conferences for high school juniors to college seniors. 2 weeks throughout the summer out on our campus in Manitou Springs, Colorado, right at the foot of Pikes Peak. And some of the biggest names in Christian evangelicalism today are products of that, meaning they went to that when they were an emerging adult. That's what we do. That's the bread and butter of Summit's ministry, is really to raise up new generation after new generation of young people who are deployed into the world with a really strong biblical worldview, and they know why they have that worldview. In addition, Summit, about 25 years ago, started writing Bible curriculum for Christian schools, which we still do. And then my department is really new at Summit, only a year and a half old. And what we do is work with schools, parents, universities to answer the question, how can we better nurture biblical worldview formation in our students, in our children? So that's the kind of information you'll find at the Summit website, in addition to a really compelling bookstore.
I happen to know that my daughter is applying as we speak to be a part of that very thing you were describing, and she's excited to do it. So, Roger, this is so critically important. I hope teachers who listen and administrators who are listening are thinking deeply about this, parents as well. It's a great self-audit, quite frankly, I think, this conversation, and I certainly benefited from it. So thank you very much for your time today.
Chris, so great to be with you, and God bless your work.
And that'll do it for this week's edition of Making the Leap. I hope you'll check it out wherever you listen to podcasts. You can subscribe to it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube as well. And look for all the information in the show notes page, and it'll tell you everything you need to know about how to reach out to us. And until next week, we'll see you right here on Making the Leap.
Making the Leap is a podcast presentation courtesy of the Herzog Foundation. We'd love your feedback by rating us and commenting on the show.
And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time on Making the Leap.